Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's devotional. Our thought today is going to come from Daniel chapter 1. The situation being that Nebuchadnezzar had gone up against Jerusalem. In fact, he'd gone up and seized it 3 times total. But during the process of those seizes of Jerusalem and fight against Judah, he ends up taking many of the citizens away and displants them or misplants them. And some of them he takes specifically to assimilate them into his culture and to use some of the best and brightest of Judah for his own counselors. And we see in verse 3 that the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now notice that whether or not these 4 were the only ones from Judah chosen, certainly it sounds like there were others from other tribes that were chosen as well. But these 4 are mentioned. Obviously, these 4 feature prominently in the book of Daniel, particularly Daniel, obviously, but also Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know them better as, to them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So we know these other 3 as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego a little bit better because that's how they're referred to later on primarily, using the Babylonian name that they were given. But Daniel, verse 8, purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not mentioned specifically here, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they, like Daniel, kind of followed his lead. That maybe Daniel certainly may have been the instigator, the one to go to the chief of the eunuchs and to talk about this. But I would not be at all surprised if Meshach and Abednego and Shadrach, given their faithfulness to Jehovah, if they weren't right along with Daniel as well, and they're just not mentioned here. Certainly we see the faith of those other 3 later on in the book of Daniel in the fiery furnace. And it's also not to say that there weren't others from some of the other tribes maybe who also, who go unnamed and unmentioned, who also may very well have had issue with these delicacies as well. And so just kind of throwing that out there to make it clear, especially given the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't mentioned here in verse 8. But we see Daniel, and we don't know how old Daniel is, or for that matter, the other 3. But we do know that they're referred to as children, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. Now, whether this is referring to the children of Israel because of the people of Israel, we talk about the children of Israel, or if they're literal children, and certainly these are young men, though, that we're talking about. They obviously were old enough to be able to, for them to be able to tell that they're gifted in wisdom. They possess some kind of knowledge. They are quick to learn, quick to understand. So however old that was, 10, 12, 15, who knows? But certainly no older than the teens, for sure. But that being the case, seeing Daniel's faith in verse 8 is it's very specific, it's very glaring here. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies. Why? So that he might not defile himself. That's why. And obviously this is about Jehovah. This is about, I will not do that which Jehovah has told me not to do. And so even though Daniel has been taken away, apparently from his family, if he had any back in Judah, he's been taken away from his home, certainly from from the temple, from Jerusalem. Obviously the temple even had been destroyed probably at that point. Despite all of that, Daniel has not lost hope in his purpose, even though he's lost in so many ways, his national identity as a citizen of Judah, he has not lost his individual purpose and service to God. And so he has determined, he has been steadfast in his thought process that I will not defile myself. And I would suggest that because Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, that if this request, excuse me, if this request had gone differently, and the answer was no, we will not make special accommodation for you, I would not doubt at all that Daniel would have been willing to die for refusing to eat of these delicacies. That may have meant he had to starve to death because they wouldn't give him anything else to eat. But I'm fully convinced that Daniel would have been willing to do that, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king. I'm worried that you're not going to, you're going to look gaunt. You're not going to be eating the things that everybody else eats. So he tells them, hey, test us for 10 days. Give us what we want to eat, what won't defile us, and let our appearance be examined. So he did, and at the end, verse 15 of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate of the king's delicacies. So, as for these four, notice how these four are still being mentioned. Even though they weren't mentioned in name in verse 8, I still believe that they were there, maybe following along Daniel, or they were making the request. Maybe Daniel was the one that was speaking, but they were all making the request on behalf of all of the young men of Israel, or of Judah rather. But regardless, what we have is that for these young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. But what's so impressive about this is the fact that these were young men, and when the king interviewed them, among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And that's part of the reason why they feature prominently going forward. Just the attitude that these young men have as young people, having their society completely decimated and then moved to a different society, having no support structure from family, yet they do have one another, certainly, but most importantly, they have Jehovah. And to me, that just, it really stands out about the character of Daniel and of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to hold themselves accountable to God's plan, to God's purpose, to God's law. And it certainly reminds me of passages in the New Testament as well, like Colossians chapter 1, and in verse 23, it talks about how that you were once alienated. Verse 21, Paul does to the Colossians, and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled you through his body, if indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard. The reminder of application, and I think it's especially applicable for young people, but for all of us even, that especially in a society that is in many ways not just kind of neutral on God. Many are anti-God, anti-religion of any form, anti-moral moral standards. Many people are anti-Christian in many ways. And whether it's in name or not, the values that many individuals hold as individuals who claim to be Christians, and certainly those who truly are Christians, our society is very much right now, there's a lot of anti-sentiment towards that. But it just reminds me that as individuals, we don't have to have, although it certainly helps, having that family background, having that support structure, that familial support structure to encourage us, to hold us accountable, to hold us to that, remind us of that standard. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't have that. What they did have was each other, and certainly we have the brethren. But most importantly, I would suggest that regardless of whether Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had even been there, I'm convinced Daniel still would have held to his standards. His integrity was such that he was not going to sacrifice his service to Jehovah and being defiled in the sight of Jehovah because of all of this trial that he was facing. And it just goes to show that in the end, sometimes, yeah, obviously, we do have the brethren. And that's one of the great blessings that we have as Christians, is that we have the brethren of the church who should be there to help us and to encourage us. But you know what? When we're out and about in the world, when we're at work, when we're at school, when we're on vacation, sometimes we're on our own. Maybe we're on our own with a group of friends who are not Christians and don't share our same values or standards. Sometimes we're on our own with our teammates. Sometimes we're on our own with our coworkers. And I think the example of Daniel certainly stands out as one that shows that we can hold ourselves accountable, because God is always watching. God knows whether or not we're holding ourselves to the standard that we claim to hold as Christians. And if it's only around other Christians that we are who we should be, then that speaks to an issue in our character, speaks to an issue of our integrity and our, for that matter, honesty, certainly with ourselves and with God and with others. And the reminder that we should always be steadfast in the faith. You know, Paul in Colossians 2 and verse 5, he rejoices because of their good order and the steadfastness of their faith in Christ. The Hebrew writer, talking about the components of being steadfast, he says, we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. In Hebrews 6 and verse 19, talking about the hope that is set before us, this promise of God of salvation, of a home in heaven. This hope we have is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil, talking about Jesus, that Jesus is the embodiment of our hope. Just reminding ourselves that just like people, faithful young men like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fact that they could purpose in their heart to refuse the king's delicacies, which surely, you know, for a lot of young people, there would have been curiosity there. These are things which surely he had never tasted before, maybe probably had never even had the opportunity to taste before, the type of wine which the king drank. Surely part of, you know, you could see in other individuals who might be tempted and have a part of them say, I'm really curious as to what that tastes like or what that experience is like. And our society is really centered around experience and doing what feels good and doing what is pleasurable. But Daniel purposed in his heart that it didn't matter that he had never tasted these delicacies or that wine. He was going to refrain from it because of what God said. And he held himself accountable, regardless of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being there as well. I believe all four of them would have stood on their own in faithful steadfastness in order to do that which is right in the sight of God. I think it's just a wonderful reminder for each one of us that if we are not currently at a point where we are able to hold ourselves to the standard of God when we're on our own with others around us, with that social pressure that maybe others may use against us or use on us, that we take a look at the example of Daniel, take a look at the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego later on in Daniel, and recognize that they were absolutely determined. He had purposed in his heart. There was a determination there to make sure they did what God wanted them to do, and not to allow any other influence to cause them to fall from that. And we need Christians like that. As Christians, that's the way we're supposed to be. We are supposed to be steadfast, absolutely firm, that no matter what Satan tries to tempt us with, no matter what friends try to get under our skin, no matter what type of influences are used to try to make us feel bad or to feel like we are the weird one or the strange one or one who is ostracized by others, that we stand firm on what God wants us to do. Make sure that we exhibit the character, the example that we're supposed to, because of that determination, that inward conviction. And we talk about faith all the time. The term faith in the New Testament, pistis, is the Greek term, and variations of pistis. It means conviction. It means persuasion. being convicted, absolutely convicted. Well, if I'm absolutely convicted, then I'm going to be like Daniel, who had determined, he had forethought. What am I going to do? Because I know that I'm going to be faced with these types of temptations. What am I going to do? He purposed in his heart that he would not partake, no matter what happened, no matter what the consequences may be. And that's the attitude that you and I need to have as well. All right, that's the devotional for you today. Lord willing, our next devotional will be on Thursday. I hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.